The broken boot. The broken boot. Caleb Whitmore thought he'd buried his past deep enough that it couldn't claw its way back to the surface. He was wrong. The 8-year-old girl standing on his porch didn't knock. She didn't have to. Her bare feet, caked in blood and dust, told him she'd walked through hell to find him. In her trembling hands, she clutched a broken cavalry boot, split at the seam and worn to nothing. Inside it, folded tight against the leather, was a letter with his name written in a hand he'd hoped never to see again. Some debts don't die. They just wait. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this goes. The wind came hard across the Wyoming plain, carrying with it the smell of sage and the promise of rain that never seemed to fall. Caleb Whitmore stood at the fence line of his ranch, one boot propped on the lowest rail, his eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd learned long ago that peace was a temporary condition. He was 43 years old, though the lines carved deep around his eyes made him look older. His hands were scarred from barbed wire and rope burn, his shoulders broad but slightly hunched, as if he carried weight no one else could see. The ranch wasn't much, 300 acres of stubborn grass, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a house built from rough-cut timber and stubbornness. But it was his, bought with union pay and the kind of silence that came after a war ended but never really stopped. Caleb didn't talk much, didn't need to. The nearest town, Millridge, sat 8 miles south, far enough that he could go weeks without seeing another soul. That was how he liked it, quiet, alone, forgotten. Until the day the girl arrived. It was late afternoon when he saw her. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving along the road where no shadow should be. He squinted, adjusting the brim of his hat against the slanting sun. The shape didn't disappear. It grew larger, closer, resolving into the figure of a child walking alone through the empty country. Caleb's chest tightened. He set down the post he'd been sinking and walked toward the house, his hand instinctively brushing the holster at his hip. Out here, nothing good came unannounced. By the time he reached the porch, the girl had made it to the gate. She stopped there, swaying slightly, her small frame silhouetted against the pale dirt road. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dress was torn at the hem, stained dark with sweat and something that looked like dried blood. Her feet were bare, the soles blackened and split. Her hair, a tangled mess of brown curls, hung limp around a face smudged with dust and exhaustion. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were old, too old for a child, sharp and hollow at the same time, like she'd seen things no one her age should ever witness. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at him, clutching something against her chest. Caleb descended the porch steps slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You lost, girl?" She shook her head just once. "You hurt?" Another shake. He came closer, stopping a few feet from the gate. Up close he could see the tremor in her hands, the way her lips were cracked and peeling. She'd been walking a long time. Days, maybe. "What's your name?" Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Mara." "Mara," he repeated, softening his tone. "Where's your folks?" Her eyes dropped to the object in her hands. Slowly, she lifted it toward him. It was a boot. A cavalry boot, old and battered, the leather split along the side seam. The heel was worn down to almost nothing, and the laces were gone. It had been pieced back together with wire and what looked like sinew, but it was still falling apart. Caleb's breath caught. He knew that boot. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Mara's chin quivered, but she didn't cry. She reached inside the boot and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and creased from being opened and closed too many times. She held it out to him with both hands, like an offering. Caleb took it, his fingers unsteady. He recognized the handwriting before he even unfolded it. "Caleb, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I told Mara to find you if I didn't come back. I know it's been years. I know you don't owe me anything. But she's got no one else. They're coming for her. The same men who came for me. I can't protect her anymore, but you can. You're the only man I ever trusted to do what's right when it mattered. I'm calling in the debt. Not for me. For her. Thomas Hale." The name hit him like a fist to the gut. Thomas Hale. Caleb hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over 15 years. Hadn't let himself think it either. But here it was, written in ink that had bled slightly from rain or sweat or tears, and suddenly the past wasn't past anymore. He looked up at the girl, Mara, and saw Thomas in the shape of her nose, the set of her jaw. Saw him in the way she stood, small but unbroken, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure would come. "Your father sent you here," Caleb said quietly. "Yes, sir." "How long you been walking?" 4 days. 4 days, barefoot, alone. She couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds soaking wet, and she'd walked 4 days through open country to find a man she'd never met because her father told her to. Caleb folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He opened the gate. "Come on then," he said. "Let's get you inside." Mara hesitated, her eyes searching his face for something. Reassurance, maybe, or permission to trust. Then she stepped through the gate, still clutching the broken boot like it was the most valuable thing in the world. But inside the house, Caleb set a pot of water to boil and found a clean cloth. Mara sat at the table, silent and watchful, her hands folded in her lap. The boot rested beside her. He knelt in front of her and gently lifted one of her feet. The sole was torn open in places, caked with blood and dirt. He worked carefully, cleaning the wounds with warm water, his touch as light as he could make it. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. "You walked all this way without shoes?" he asked. "I had shoes," she said softly, "but they broke. I tried to fix them, but it's all right." He wrapped her feet in strips of clean linen, tying them snug but not too tight. "You did good, real good." When he finished, he poured her a cup of water and set it in front of her. She drank it slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "You hungry?" She nodded. He fried up some salt pork and made cornbread from what little he had in the cupboard. She ate without speaking, methodical and careful, like someone who'd gone hungry before and knew not to waste a single bite. While she ate, Caleb sat across from her, the letter spread flat on the table. He read it again, slower this time, letting the weight of each word settle. They're coming for her. He'd spent 15 years trying to forget Thomas Hale, trying to bury the memory of what happened during the war, the choices they'd made, the things they'd done to survive. Thomas had saved his life once, pulled him out of a burning supply depot while Confederate rifles cracked in the darkness. Caleb had tried to return the favor a dozen times over, but Thomas always waved him off. "You don't owe me nothing," Thomas used to say. "We're square." But they weren't. Not really. And Thomas had known it. Now Thomas was dead and his daughter was sitting in Caleb's kitchen, eating cornbread with bandaged feet, and somewhere out there men were looking for her. "Mara," Caleb said gently, "who's looking for you?" She stopped chewing, her eyes flicked to the window, then back to him. "The man with the scar," she whispered. "What man?" "The one who came to our house. He told Papa he owed money. Papa said he didn't. The man said it didn't matter." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "He said Papa had to pay, or I would." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What happened to your father?" "He told me to run." Her voice cracked, just a little. "He gave me the boot and told me to find you. He said you'd know what to do." "And the man with the scar?" "I don't know. I ran. I didn't look back." Caleb leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Thomas Hale had been a good man. A damn good man. But he'd also been the kind of man who attracted trouble without meaning to, trusting the wrong people, making promises he couldn't keep, believing the world was fairer than it was. And now his daughter was paying for it. "You're safe here," Caleb said firmly. "You understand? Whatever your father owed, whoever's looking for you, they're not taking you, not while I'm breathing." Mara looked at him for a long moment, her old eyes searching his face. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, her shoulders sagged just a little. "Okay," she whispered. That night, Caleb made her a bed in the small room off the kitchen, his late mother's room, untouched for years. He found a quilt in the cedar chest and spread it over the straw mattress. Mara climbed in without a word, still holding the broken boot. "You can put that down," Caleb said gently. She shook her head. "It's Papa's." He didn't argue. He pulled the door halfway closed and returned to the main room, where he sat by the fire with Thomas's letter in his hand. "I'm calling in the debt." Caleb stared into the flames, his mind turning over the past like stones in a riverbed. He'd tried to leave the war behind, tried to build something quiet and simple, but the war had a way of following men, no matter how far they ran. And now it had found him again, in the form of a barefoot girl with her father's eyes. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window with his rifle across his lap, watching the road, because he knew, deep in his bones, that the man with the scar was coming. The next morning, Caleb rode into Millridge. The town was small, barely a street's worth of buildings, but it had a post office, a general store, and a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge came through. More importantly, it had people who knew things. He tied his horse outside the saloon and pushed through the batwing doors. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. A few men sat at the bar, nursing drinks and avoiding each other's eyes. The bartender, a grizzled man named Walt, looked up as Caleb approached. "Whitmore," Walt said, nodding. "Don't see you much." "Got a question," Caleb said, leaning against the bar. "You heard of a man with a scar? Enforcer type. Collects debts." Walt's expression darkened. "You talking about Garrick?" "Don't know his name, just heard about the scar." "That'd be Garrick." Walt poured himself a whiskey and downed it in one gulp. "Elias Garrick. Works for a syndicate out of Denver. Mean son of a bitch. Collects debts nobody else will touch." "What kind of debts?" "The kind that don't get paid back." Walt wiped his mouth. "Why you asking?" Caleb didn't answer directly. "He ever come through here?" "Couple months back. Looking for a man named Hale, Thomas Hale. Said he skipped on a contract." Caleb's chest tightened. "What kind of contract?" "Don't know. Don't want to know. But Garrick didn't find him. Left town empty-handed." Walt leaned in, lowering his voice. "Word is, Hale's dead now, and Garrick's still looking." "For what?" "For whatever Hale left behind." Caleb's hands curled into fists. "Thanks, Walt." He turned to leave, but Walt called after him. "Whitmore, you mixed up in this?" Caleb paused at the door, his back to the bartender. "Not yet," he said, "but I will be." When Caleb returned to the ranch, Mara was sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in the quilt. She looked up as he dismounted, her eyes anxious. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would." He sat down beside her, his rifle propped against the railing. For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of rain that still wouldn't fall. "You know the man with the scar?" Mara asked quietly. "I know of him." "Is he coming here?" Caleb looked at her, this small, brave girl who'd walked 4 days through hell because her father told her to. He thought about Thomas Hale, about the war, about the debt he'd carried for 15 years without ever paying it. "Maybe," he said, "but if he does, he'll have to go through me first." Mara nodded slowly, like she understood. She leaned against his shoulder and Caleb didn't move. "Papa said you were a good man," she whispered. Caleb's throat tightened. "Your father was wrong about a lot of things. Not about you." He didn't answer. He just sat there, watching the horizon, waiting for the storm he knew was coming. Because the past never stayed buried, and Elias Garrick was already on his way. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Caleb taught Mara how to feed the chickens, how to pump water from the well without spilling half of it, how to read the sky for weather that might actually come. She was a quick learner, quiet and observant, watching everything he did with those old eyes that seemed to catalog the world for future reference. She never let go of the boot. It sat beside her bed at night, traveled with her during the day, rested on the porch steps while she shelled peas or mended the tears in her dress with thread Caleb had bought in town. He didn't ask her about it again. Some things a person needed to hold on to, and he understood that better than most. But beneath the surface calm, Caleb was preparing for war. He cleaned his rifles, oiled the mechanisms until they moved smooth as silk. He counted his ammunition, taking stock of what he had and what he'd need if things went bad. He rode the property line every morning, memorizing every dip in the land, every cluster of rocks that could provide cover, every approach a man on horseback might take. The ranch had always been defensible. He'd chosen it for that reason, even if he'd never admitted it to himself. But now he studied it with the cold calculation of a soldier planning a battlefield. On the fourth day, he rode into Millridge again. This time, he didn't go to the saloon. He went to the telegraph office. The clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up as Caleb entered. "Help you, Mr. Whitmore?" "Need to send a message," Caleb said, sliding a coin across the counter. "Where to?" "Fort Laramie. Attention of Samuel Cross." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. He pulled out a form and dipped his pen. "What's the message?" Caleb dictated slowly, choosing each word with care. "The debt is called. Need your answer. Whitmore." The clerk wrote it down, read it back, and nodded. "Should get there by tomorrow morning." "Good." Caleb turned to leave, then paused. "Anyone else send telegrams recently? Strangers, maybe?" The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the door as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "There was a man, 3 days ago, big fellow, scar running down the left side of his face." "Sent a message to Denver." Caleb's pulse quickened, but his expression didn't change. "You remember what it said?" "I'm not supposed to—" "I'm not asking you to violate any sacred trust," Caleb interrupted, his voice flat. "Just wondering if it mentioned names." The clerk swallowed. "It mentioned a name. Hale. Said the search was expanding to known associates." Known associates. Caleb's jaw tightened. Garrick was smart. He wasn't just looking for Mara. He was looking for anyone Thomas might have trusted. "Appreciate it," Caleb said, and left before the clerk could respond. On the ride back, he let his horse take its time, his mind working through possibilities. Garrick knew Thomas was dead. That much was clear, but he was still searching, which meant whatever debt Thomas owed wasn't the kind that died with the debtor. It was the kind that transferred, the kind that fell on whoever was left behind. A child. The thought made Caleb's blood run cold. He'd seen men like Garrick during the war, men who treated human lives like currency, who believed everything had a price and everyone could be bought or broken. The scar didn't make Garrick dangerous. The emptiness behind his eyes did. When Caleb reached the ranch, Mara was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of struggling vegetables. She looked up as he dismounted, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "You were gone a long time," she said. "Had business in town." She nodded, accepting this without question, and returned to her work. Caleb watched her for a moment, this small, resilient girl who'd survived things that would have broken grown men, and felt the weight of Thomas's letter settle heavier on his shoulders. That evening, after supper, Mara sat by the fire while Caleb repaired a bridle. The silence between them had become comfortable, familiar. She didn't need constant reassurance anymore, didn't flinch at sudden movements or watch the door like she expected it to burst open. She was starting to trust. "Mr. Whitmore?" she said quietly. "Caleb's fine." "Caleb." She tested the name, rolling it around in her mouth. "Were you and Papa friends?" He paused, the leather strap halfway through the buckle. "We were soldiers together." "In the war?" "Yeah." "Papa didn't talk about the war much," she said. "Said it was over and didn't need remembering." Caleb smiled faintly. "Sounds like Thomas." "But he remembered you." She looked at him directly, her gaze steady. "He said you were the bravest man he ever knew, said you didn't quit, even when quitting would have been easier." Caleb's hand stilled. "Your father had a generous memory." "He didn't lie," Mara said firmly. "Not to me." "No," Caleb agreed softly. "I don't suppose he did." She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "The man with the scar. Papa was afraid of him. I could tell, even though he didn't say it. He tried to hide it, but I knew." "Fear's not weakness," Caleb said. "Sometimes it's just good sense." "Are you afraid?" He considered lying, then decided she deserved better. "Yeah, but not of dying, of failing." "Failing what?" "Your father, you." He set the bridle aside and met her eyes. "He asked me to keep you safe. That's not something I take lightly." Mara was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Papa made me promise something before I left." "What's that?" "He made me promise that if you couldn't help, if it was too dangerous, I'd keep going, find someone else. He said I wasn't to let anyone die for me." Caleb's chest tightened. Even at the end, Thomas had been trying to protect everyone but himself. That's not your decision to make, Mara, or his. It's mine. But I'm not dying, he said firmly, and neither are you. Understand? She nodded slowly, though he could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. She'd seen too much to believe in promises, even ones made with conviction. 2 days later, the reply came. Caleb was mending fence when he saw the rider approaching from the east, moving at an easy lope across the grassland. He recognized the horse first, a sturdy roan with white stockings, and then the man, Samuel Cross, sitting tall in the saddle despite the years that had added gray to his beard and weight to his frame. Caleb set down his tools and walked to meet him. Samuel dismounted with a grunt, his knees creaking audibly. "Whitmore, been a long time." "Too long," Caleb said, gripping his hand. "Didn't know if you'd come." "Got your message." Samuel's eyes were sharp beneath thick brows. "The debt is called. That's language we don't use lightly." "No, we don't." "So who died?" "Thomas Hale." Samuel's expression shifted, something like pain flickering across his weathered face. "Damn. I always figured Thomas would outlive us all. He was too stubborn to die young." "Stubborn didn't save him," Caleb said quietly. He gestured toward the house. "Come on, there's someone you should meet." Inside, Mara was setting the table for lunch. She froze when Samuel entered, her eyes going wide at the sight of the stranger. "It's all right," Caleb said gently. "This is Samuel Cross. He's a friend. Fought with your father and me during the war." Samuel removed his hat, his expression softening. "You must be Mara." She nodded slowly. "Your father talked about you," Samuel said. "In his letters. Said you were smart as a whip and twice as tough." "He wrote you letters?" Mara asked. "Every few months, right up until about a year ago." Samuel glanced at Caleb. Then they stopped. They sat around the table, and Caleb told Samuel everything: the letter, the boot, Garrick's search, the debt that wouldn't die. Samuel listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. When Caleb finished, Samuel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Elias Garrick. I've heard the name. Works for the Tolliver Syndicate out of Denver. They're not just debt collectors, they're contractors. They broker deals, enforce terms, make problems disappear. If Thomas owed them, it wasn't money. It was something bigger." "Like what?" Caleb asked. "Information, maybe. Access. Thomas worked as a surveyor after the war, didn't he? Traveled all over the territories, mapping railroad routes, mineral deposits, water rights. He would have seen things, known things. Maybe he saw something he wasn't supposed to." Caleb's mind raced. It made a terrible kind of sense. Thomas had always been curious, always asking questions, always digging deeper than was safe. If he'd stumbled onto something the Tolliver Syndicate wanted kept quiet, land fraud, illegal claims, water theft, they'd have leverage over him. And when he refused to play along, they'd have marked him. "So Garrick's not just collecting a debt," Caleb said slowly. "He's tying up a loose end." "And the girl's the last thread," Samuel finished grimly. He looked at Mara, his expression gentle despite the harsh words. "They think she knows what her father knew, or they're afraid she might." "I don't know anything," Mara said, her voice small. "Papa never told me about his work. He just drew maps." "Doesn't matter," Samuel said. "They can't take that chance." Silence settled over the table, heavy and suffocating. Mara's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white. "How many men does Garrick travel with?" Caleb asked. "Usually 4 or 5. Hard men. The kind who don't ask questions." Samuel paused. "But if he's coming after someone under protection, he might bring more." "Under protection," Caleb repeated. "That's why you're here." Samuel smiled grimly. "You called the debt. I answered. Same as you would have for me, same as Thomas did for you. We're old men now, Caleb, but we're not dead. And we sure as hell aren't helpless. We need more than 2. Already ahead of you." Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Sent word to the others before I left. Monroe's riding up from Colorado. Should be here in 3 days. Jessup's coming from the fort. He's only a day out. That's 4 of us." "Against how many?" "Won't know until they show." Samuel's jaw set. But we held worse odds at Shiloh. Caleb nodded slowly. The names brought back memories he'd tried to bury. Good men, loyal men, the kind who'd stand beside you when the world went to hell. If they were coming, it was because they believed in the same code Thomas had died for. You protect your own, no matter the cost. Mara, Caleb said gently, would you go check on the chickens? Make sure they've got water. She looked between them, understanding that she was being sent away, but she didn't argue. She slipped out the door, closing it softly behind her. When she was gone, Samuel leaned forward. You know this might not end clean. I know. Garrick's not going to walk away just because we ask nicely. Men like him don't negotiate, they escalate. Then we escalate first, Caleb said flatly. We make it clear that coming after her costs more than they're willing to pay. And if they don't care about the cost? Caleb's eyes were hard. Then we make them pay it anyway. Samuel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but we do this smart. We fortify the ranch, set up sight lines, prepare fallback positions, and we get the girl somewhere safe before it starts. She won't go. We'll make her. You don't know her, Caleb said. She's Thomas's daughter, stubborn runs in the blood. Samuel snorted. Then she'll fit right in with the rest of us. Over the next 2 days, the ranch transformed. Samuel proved to be as resourceful as Caleb remembered, organizing their defenses with military precision. They reinforced the barn door, stacked hay bales near the windows for cover, filled barrels with water in case of fire. Caleb showed Samuel the approaches, the weak points, the places where a man with a rifle could hold off a dozen. Monroe arrived on the 3rd day, riding in at sunset with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. He was leaner than Caleb remembered, his hair gone completely gray, but his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence. Whitmore, he said, dismounting. You look like hell. You look worse, Caleb replied, gripping his hand. Monroe grinned. Fair enough. He glanced around the ranch, taking in the preparations. Samuel briefed me on the ride up. This about Thomas's girl? Yeah. Figured I owed him one. Monroe's expression sobered. He pulled me out of that river at Antietam. Never got the chance to pay him back. You're paying him back now, Caleb said. Jessup arrived the next morning, a quiet man with steady hands and a reputation for being the best shot in their old company. He didn't say much, just nodded at Caleb and got to work checking sight lines and range estimates. With 4 of them, the ranch felt less like a homestead and more like a garrison. They fell into old patterns without discussing it, rotating watch schedules, coordinating fields of fire, planning contingencies. Mara watched them with wide eyes, seeing in their movements the shadow of the war they'd fought and the bonds they'd forged. On the 5th evening, they gathered around the table for supper. Mara had cooked, simple fare, beans and cornbread, but it felt almost ceremonial. 4 old soldiers and 1 young girl bound together by loyalty to a dead man. You ever think about why we're really here? Monroe asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Because Thomas asked, Samuel said simply. It's more than that. Monroe looked at Mara. We're here because we remember what it was like to be helpless, to watch people suffer and not be able to stop it. Thomas gave us a chance to do something about it this time. He gave us a lot more than that, Jessup said quietly. It was the most he'd spoken since arriving. He gave us a reason to believe we weren't just killers, that what we did during the war meant something. Caleb's throat tightened. He'd spent 15 years trying to convince himself that the war had been necessary, that the killing had served a purpose. But it was Thomas who'd shown him how to carry the weight of it, not by forgetting, but by choosing to protect instead of destroy. He was a good man, Caleb said quietly. Better than the rest of us. No, Mara said suddenly. They all turned to look at her. Papa wasn't better. He just saw the good in people even when they couldn't see it themselves. That's what he told me once. He said every person has something worth saving, even if they've buried it deep. Samuel cleared his throat roughly. Kid's got his wisdom all right. More than wisdom, Monroe said, smiling at her. She's got his courage too. Walking 4 days alone? Most grown men wouldn't have made it. Mara's cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. I made a promise. I had to keep it. And we're going to make sure you can, Caleb said firmly. That night, after Mara had gone to bed, the four men sat on the porch in the darkness. The air was cool, the stars thick overhead, the kind of night that made a man feel small against the vastness of the world. "How do you think it'll go?" Monroe asked. "Depends on Garrick," Samuel said. "If he's smart, he'll see we're dug in and reconsider." "And if he's not smart?" Jessup asked. "Then we teach him the hard way," Caleb said. They sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. Caleb found himself thinking about Thomas, about the night they'd met during the chaos of their first battle. Thomas had been green then, terrified but determined, and Caleb had taken him under his wing the way older soldiers did. They'd survived together, bled together, learned together how to stay human in the midst of inhumanity. And now Thomas was gone, and his daughter slept in Caleb's house. And somewhere out there, a man with a scar was riding toward them with violence in his heart. "You ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" Monroe asked softly. "Every damn day," Samuel said. "But we're doing it anyway," Caleb added. "Because right or wrong, it's what Thomas would have done for any of us." "Amen to that," Jessup murmured. The next morning, Caleb was teaching Mara how to milk the cow when Samuel came running from the road, his face grim. "Riders," he said. "6 of them, coming from the east." Caleb's heart dropped. "How far?" "Mile, maybe less, moving slow like they want to be seen." Caleb looked at Mara. "Go inside, stay away from the windows." "But now, Mara." She must have heard something in his voice because she didn't argue. She ran for the house, the broken boot clutched in her hands. The 4 men gathered near the barn, rifles ready. Caleb scanned the horizon and saw them, 6 dark shapes moving through the grass, spread out in a loose line. Professional, disciplined, not the kind of men who scared easy. "That'll be Garrick," Samuel said quietly. As they drew closer, Caleb could make out details. The lead rider was a big man, broad-shouldered and heavy, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the scar, a pale line running from his left temple down to his jaw, twisting his face into a permanent sneer. The riders stopped 50 yards from the gate. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Garrick dismounted. He walked forward alone, his hands away from his weapons, his movements deliberate. When he was close enough to be heard without shouting, he stopped. "I'm looking for Caleb Whitmore," he called out. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping metal. "You found him," Caleb replied, stepping forward. Garrick's eyes swept over the 4 men, taking in their positions, their weapons, the set of their shoulders. "You know why I'm here. I know you're trespassing. I'm collecting a debt." "Thomas Hale is dead," Caleb said flatly. "Whatever he owed died with him." "Not how it works." Garrick tilted his head. "The contract transferred to his heir, the girl, Mara Hale. She's 8 years old enough to carry a debt." Garrick's smile was cold. "You turn her over, this ends clean. No blood, no trouble, just business." "And if I don't?" Garrick shrugged. "Then it gets messy. Your choice." Caleb felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, the eyes of his friends on his back, the presence of Mara hiding somewhere behind him. Everything in this moment balanced on a knife's edge. "Here's my choice," Caleb said, his voice carrying clear and hard across the distance. "You turn around, ride back to Denver, and tell the Tolliver Syndicate that the debt is void. The girl's under my protection. Anyone who comes for her goes through me." Garrick's smile widened. "You think 4 old men are going to stop me?" "I think you've got 6 men," Caleb said calmly. "I've got 4, but we're standing on ground we know, defending something worth dying for. How many of your men are willing to die for a paycheck?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Garrick's eyes. He glanced back at his riders, then at Caleb. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Caleb agreed. "But it's not starting today either." Garrick stared at him for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. He swung into the saddle, and without another word, the 6 riders turned and rode east, back the way they'd come. The tension didn't break until they were out of sight. "That went better than expected," Monroe said, exhaling. "That wasn't better," Samuel said grimly. "That was a scout. He wanted to see how we'd respond, what we had. how serious we were. Now he knows. So what do we do? Jessup asked. Caleb lowered his rifle, his eyes still on the horizon. We prepare for the real fight, because next time he won't come to talk. Inside the house, Mara sat at the table with the broken boot clutched to her chest, her face pale but composed. She looked up when the four men entered, searching their expressions for answers she was afraid to ask for out loud. They're gone, Caleb said, setting his rifle against the wall. For now. But they're coming back, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, meeting her eyes directly. They're coming back. Probably tomorrow night, maybe the night after. When they do, it won't be to talk. Mara's fingers tightened on the boot. Because of what Papa knew. Because of what they think you might know, Samuel corrected gently. Or what you might say someday. Men like Garrick don't leave loose ends. I could tell them, Mara said quietly. Tell them I don't know anything. Make them believe it. They wouldn't, Monroe said, his voice kind but firm. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. You're a witness to your father's death. You're a reminder that they killed a good man over something that wasn't worth his life. As long as you're alive, you're a threat to them. Mara absorbed this in silence, her young face aging another year in the span of a heartbeat. Then she straightened her shoulders, and Caleb saw Thomas in the set of her jaw, the stubborn tilt of her chin. Then what do we do? She asked. We fight, Caleb said simply. And we win. How? By being smarter, faster, and more committed than they are. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Your father sent you to me because he trusted me to keep you safe. I gave him my word, and I'm going to keep it. But I need you to trust me too. Can you do that? Mara studied his face for a long moment, those old eyes seeing past the scars and the hard edges to something deeper. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. I trust you, she said. All of you. Jessup, who'd been standing quietly by the window, turned and nodded to her. It was the first acknowledgement he'd given her directly, and the weight of it seemed to mean something. Good, Samuel said, pulling out a hand-drawn map of the ranch and spreading it on the table. Because here's what we're going to do. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning in meticulous detail. Samuel sketched out positions, fields of fire, fallback routes. Monroe calculated distances and angles, using his surveyor's eye to identify the best defensive positions. Jessup checked ammunition counts and cleaned weapons with the methodical precision of a man who understood that preparation was the difference between living and dying. And Caleb tied it all together, coordinating their efforts with the calm authority he'd developed during the war. Mara watched everything, absorbing information like a sponge. When Samuel explained the importance of high ground, she asked why. When Monroe discussed crossfire patterns, she wanted to know how they'd avoid shooting each other. When Jessup showed her how to load a rifle, just in case, she paid attention with an intensity that made Caleb's chest ache. She was 8 years old, and she was learning how to survive a siege. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, Caleb walked the perimeter one last time. The land rolled away in all directions, beautiful and exposed. He'd always loved the openness of it, the way you could see weather coming from miles away, the sense of freedom that came with endless sky. Now that openness felt like a liability. Second thoughts? Samuel asked, falling into step beside him. Always have second thoughts, Caleb said. Third and fourth ones, too. But you're not backing down. No. They walked in silence for a while, their boots crunching on the dry grass. In the distance, a coyote called, lonely and defiant. You know what Thomas told me once? Samuel said. After Fredericksburg, when we were sitting in the mud waiting to see if we'd live through the night. He said the hardest part of being a good man wasn't choosing between right and wrong. It was choosing between right and safe. Caleb glanced at him. And what did you say? I said that was easy for him to say, since he always chose right anyway. Samuel smiled faintly. But I understood what he meant. Every man reaches a point where he has to decide what kind of person he's going to be. Not in his head, but in his actions. When everything's on the line and nobody would blame him for walking away. This is that moment, Caleb said quietly. Yeah, it is. Samuel stopped, turning to face him directly. And I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow or the day after, I'm proud to stand with you. Thomas chose well when he sent his daughter here. Caleb's throat tightened. We might die doing this. Probably will eventually anyway, Samuel said with a shrug. Might as well die for something that matters. They returned to the house as darkness settled over the land. Inside, Monroe had made a stew from what little they had in the pantry, and Mara had set the table with careful precision. It felt absurdly normal, almost peaceful, except for the rifles stacked by the door and the tension thrumming beneath every word. They ate mostly in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Mara pushed her food around her plate, eating mechanically, her eyes distant. Caleb wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the fear he could see building behind her careful composure, but words felt inadequate. It was Jessup who finally spoke, his quiet voice cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth. Your father saved my life once, he said, looking at Mara. Did he ever tell you about that? She shook her head. We were pinned down in a tobacco field, Confederates on 3 sides, no way out. I took a bullet in the leg and couldn't run. Everyone else pulled back, not because they were cowards, but because staying meant dying, and my wound looked worse than it was. Everyone except Thomas. Jessup's weathered face softened with memory. He came back for me. Dragged me half a mile through enemy fire, took 2 bullets himself doing it. When I asked him why he risked it, you know what he said? Mara leaned forward slightly. What? He said every person matters. Every single one. And the moment we start deciding who's worth saving and who isn't, we lose the thing we're fighting for. Jessup met her eyes. You matter, Mara. Not because of what you know or don't know, not because of who your father was or what he did. You matter because you're a person, and people are worth protecting. That's why we're here. Tears welled in Mara's eyes, the first Caleb had seen since she'd arrived. She blinked them back fiercely, but one escaped, tracing a clean line down her dusty cheek. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank us yet, Monroe said gently. Thank us when this is over and you're safe. That night they set watch rotations. 2 men awake at all times, 2 sleeping. Caleb took the first shift with Samuel, sitting on the porch with rifles across their laps and the stars wheeling overhead. You think Garrick will come tonight? Samuel asked. No, he'll wait. Let us tire ourselves out watching for shadows. Caleb scanned the darkness. He'll come when we're exhausted, when our guard starts to slip. Probably right before dawn. Smart. He's not stupid. Mean, ruthless, but not stupid. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then said, You ever wonder what Thomas saw when he looked at us? What made him think we were worth saving? I think he saw what we could be, Caleb said slowly, not what we were. He had a gift for that, seeing potential in broken things. We were pretty damn broken. Still are in some ways. Caleb shifted his rifle. But maybe that's the point. Maybe being broken is what makes us understand why fighting for something matters. People who've never lost anything don't know what they're protecting. Deep thoughts for a cattle rancher, Samuel said with a slight smile. Blame the company I keep. They lapsed into comfortable silence, watching the night. An owl called from somewhere near the barn, hunting. The wind moved through the grass like whispered secrets. Caleb found his mind drifting to Thomas, to all the conversations they'd had during the war, the promises they'd made to each other about the kind of men they'd be when it was over. Thomas had kept those promises. He'd built a life, raised a daughter, tried to do right even when it cost him, and in the end, it had cost him everything. But Mara was still here, still alive, still fighting. That had to count for something. The next day dawned cold and clear, the kind of morning that made every detail sharp and vivid. Caleb barely slept during his off shift, his mind too active, his nerves too tight. By the time the sun crested the horizon, all 4 men were awake, moving through their final preparations with grim efficiency. Monroe reinforced the barn door with additional timber, creating a strong point they could fall back to if the house became untenable. Jessup positioned water barrels strategically, both for drinking and for fighting fires. Samuel checked and rechecked their ammunition, organizing it by caliber and position. And Caleb walked Mara through the plan one more time. When the shooting starts, you go to the root cellar, he said, kneeling so they were eye level. You stay there, no matter what you hear, no matter how long it takes. You don't come out until one of us comes to get you. Understand? What if none of you can come? She asked quietly. The question hung between them, heavy and terrible. Caleb wanted to lie, to promise her that wouldn't happen, but she deserved honesty. If none of us can come by sunrise tomorrow, you wait until full daylight. Then you take the horse, the bay, she's the steadiest, and you ride west. There's a settlement called Copper Ridge, about 15 miles. You ask for a woman named Margaret Chen. She runs the boarding house. You tell her Caleb Whitmore sent you, and she'll take care of you. I won't leave you, Mara said, her voice fierce. You will if you have to, Caleb said firmly. Your father didn't send you to me so you could die protecting me. He sent you so you could live. If running is what keeps you alive, you run. Promise me. Mara's jaw worked, rebellion and fear warring in her expression. Finally, she nodded. I promise. Good girl. He stood, ruffling her hair gently. Now go gather the things you'll need. Food, water, a blanket. Keep them in the cellar, ready to go. She hesitated, then threw her arms around his waist, hugging him with desperate strength. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her, feeling how small she was, how fragile. It's going to be all right, he murmured. She didn't answer, she just held on tighter. The day stretched out interminably, each hour feeling like 3. They took turns resting, eating, checking positions. Mara stayed close to the house, her eyes tracking between the 4 men, memorizing their faces as if trying to burn them into permanent memory. Around mid-afternoon, Monroe spotted dust on the eastern horizon. Riders, he called out. Still a ways off, but coming steady. Caleb joined him at the eastern window, squinting against the sun. He counted them as they resolved from dust to shapes to men. 8 riders this time, not 6. Garrick had brought reinforcements. Guess he took us seriously, Samuel muttered. Good, Caleb said. Means he's worried. They watched the riders approach, noting how they spread out as they got closer, forming a wide arc that would be hard to defend against. Garrick was in the center again, but this time he didn't dismount when they stopped. He stayed in the saddle, his men arrayed on either side like a military formation. Last chance, Whitmore, Garrick called out, his voice carrying clear in the still air. Send out the girl, and we ride away. Everyone lives. Already gave you my answer, Caleb shouted back. Then you're a fool. Garrick's hand moved to his rifle. We're not leaving without her. Then you're not leaving, Caleb said flatly. For a long moment, nothing moved. The 8 riders sat their horses. The 4 defenders held their positions. Mara, hidden in the cellar, clutched her father's broken boot and tried not to breathe too loud. Then Garrick raised his hand. So be it, he said, and brought it down. The riders spurred their horses forward, splitting into 2 groups, 4 heading for the house, 4 angling toward the barn. Rifles cracked, the sound sharp and final in the clear air. Caleb fired, saw one rider jerk and fall. Samuel's rifle spoke twice in quick succession, methodical and deadly. Monroe tracked a target, led it slightly, squeezed the trigger. Another rider went down. But the others kept coming. Bullets slammed into the walls of the house, punching through wood, shattering glass. Caleb dropped below the window, reloading with practiced speed. Beside him, Samuel was doing the same, his face set in hard lines. They're going for the barn, Monroe shouted from the other window. Let them, Caleb yelled back. We knew they would. The 4 riders reached the barn and dismounted, using their horses for cover as they advanced on the door. Jessup, positioned in the hayloft with a clear field of fire, waited until they were committed. Then he opened up. His first shot took the lead man in the chest, spinning him backward. His second caught another in the shoulder. The remaining 2 scrambled for better cover, returning fire wildly, their shots going high and wide. At the house, the other 4 riders had dismounted as well, spreading out to flank the building. Caleb tracked one moving along the south wall, waited for him to step into the open, and fired. The man dropped without a sound. 3 down, Samuel said. 5 still moving. Garrick? Still mounted, hanging back. Caleb risked a glance through the window. Garrick sat his horse about 60 yards out, watching the fight unfold with cold calculation. He wasn't participating. He was assessing, looking for weaknesses, waiting for the right moment to commit. Smart bastard, Caleb muttered. A crash came from the back of the house, someone trying to force the door. Monroe was already moving, positioning himself with a clear shot. When the door splintered open, he fired twice. There was a scream, then silence. "Back door's compromised," Monroe called out. "Fall back to the interior positions," Caleb ordered. They moved with practiced efficiency, abandoning the exterior windows for the better cover of the interior walls. It gave up visibility for protection, but at this point they needed to conserve ammunition and avoid taking hits. Outside, the gunfire had slowed to sporadic shots as the remaining attackers regrouped. Caleb could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their next move. They'd be coming again soon, all at once, trying to overwhelm through sheer aggression. "How many rounds left?" he asked. 60, maybe 70, Samuel said. "I've got 40, Monroe added. From the barn, Jessup's voice carried across the yard. 35. Not enough for a sustained fight. They'd have to make every shot count. "When they come again, aim for center mass," Caleb said. "Don't try for fancy shots. We need stops, not wounds." The men nodded, checking their rifles one last time. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. 2 men rushed the front door, firing as they ran. 1 came through the shattered back door, and 2 more moved on the barn, trying to flush Jessup out. Caleb met the front assault with controlled fire, dropping 1 attacker on the porch steps. Samuel took the second with a shot that echoed like thunder. Monroe engaged the man at the back, trading shots in a deadly exchange that ended when Monroe's bullet found its mark. At the barn, Jessup was pinned down, return fire forcing him away from his vantage point. Caleb could see the 2 attackers advancing, using the barn walls for cover, getting closer to the ladder that led to the loft. "Monroe, suppressing fire on the barn!" Caleb barked. Monroe shifted position, sending shots toward the barn that forced the attackers to duck and scatter. It gave Jessup the seconds he needed to reposition, and when one of the attackers tried to rush the ladder, Jessup was waiting. The man fell, and his partner retreated, diving behind a water trough. The gunfire died down again. Smoke drifted through the house, acrid and choking. Caleb's ears rang from the noise, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Count!" he called out. "2 still moving at the barn," Jessup responded. "1 pinned, 1 mobile." "I've got eyes on 1 near the east fence," Samuel said. That left Garrick, and at least 1 other rider unaccounted for. Caleb moved to a different window, scanning for movement. The sun was lower now, shadows stretching long across the yard. In an hour, it would be dusk, and fighting in the dark favored the attackers. "We need to end this," he said quietly. "Suggestions?" Monroe asked. Before Caleb could answer, a voice called out from the yard. Not Garrick this time, someone else, younger, frightened. "We've got the girl!" Caleb's blood turned to ice. He rushed to the window, and his heart stopped. One of Garrick's men stood in the open, 30 yards from the house. He had Mara in front of him, 1 arm around her waist, a pistol pressed to her head. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, but her eyes were defiant, furious. "Put down your weapons, or she dies," the man shouted. Caleb's mind raced. The cellar. How had they gotten to the cellar? Then he understood. There was an exterior entrance, a storm door they'd overlooked in their planning. While the main assault drew their attention, someone had circled around and gone in through the back. "Don't do it," Mara shouted, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare!" The man shook her roughly. "Shut up." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger, calculating angles, wind, distance. 60 yards with a moving target and a hostage. The shot was possible, but if he missed, if the bullet went an inch wrong, Mara would die. "Clock's ticking," the man called out. "Rifles on the ground, or I paint the yard with her brains." Samuel moved beside Caleb, his face grim. "Can you make the shot?" "Maybe. Maybe's not good enough." "I know." Caleb's mind worked furiously, searching for options, finding none. They were outplayed, outmaneuvered. Garrick had won. Then Mara moved. She twisted in her captor's grip, driving her elbow backward into his stomach with surprising force. The man grunted, his arm loosening just a fraction. It was enough. Mara dropped straight down, pulling free, and the man's pistol tracked after her. Caleb didn't think. He just fired. The bullet caught the man in the throat. He He staggered backward, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers, and collapsed in the dust. Mara scrambled to her feet and ran toward the house, her legs pumping, her breath coming in gasps. Bullets kicked up dirt around her, Garrick's remaining men firing from cover, but she didn't stop. She ran like her father had taught her, zigzagging, making herself a harder target. Samuel and Monroe laid down covering fire, forcing the shooters to duck. Mara reached the porch and dove through the door, hitting the floor hard. Caleb pulled her up, checking her for wounds, his hands shaking. "Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped. I'm sorry. They came through the storm door. I tried to hide, but it's all right." He pulled her close, feeling her heart hammering against his chest. "You did good. You got free." "But now they know I'm here," she said, pulling back to look at him. "They'll keep coming." "Let them come," Caleb said grimly. He looked at Samuel and Monroe. "How many left?" "3, including Garrick," Samuel said. 3 against 4. Better odds than they'd started with. Outside, Garrick's voice rang out, cold and merciless. "You just killed the only man who wanted to take her alive, Whitmore. Now we do this the hard way." Caleb moved to the window, searching for Garrick in the fading light. He found him finally, still mounted, still watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and Caleb saw the truth there. This was personal now. Garrick had lost men, lost face, lost control. He wouldn't stop until everyone in the house was dead. "The hard way works for me," Caleb shouted back. Garrick dismounted slowly, deliberately, his boots hitting the ground with a finality that carried across the yard. The 2 remaining men with him moved to flank positions, spreading out like wolves circling wounded prey. The light was failing now, the sun a blood-red disk touching the western horizon, painting everything in shades of copper and shadow. "You should have taken the deal," Garrick called out, pulling a rifle from his saddle scabbard. "Could have walked away. Could have kept your ranch, your life, your pride. Now you lose everything." Caleb didn't respond. Words were done. He reloaded his rifle with steady hands, counted his remaining ammunition, 23 rounds, and glanced at Mara, who sat against the wall clutching her father's boot like a talisman. Her eyes met his, wide but unafraid, and he saw in them the same stubborn determination that had carried her 4 days through wilderness to find a man she'd never met. "Stay low," he told her quietly, "no matter what." She nodded, pressing herself smaller against the wall. Samuel moved to the eastern window, Monroe to the west. Jessup was still in the barn loft, his position compromised but still defensible. They were spread thin now, exhausted, running low on everything except will. But will, Caleb had learned during the war, sometimes made the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the dirt. The attack came as darkness settled, swift and coordinated. Garrick's remaining men moved under cover of twilight, using the shadows to mask their approach. One came from the north, staying low, using the fence line for concealment. The other circled wide to the south, advancing in short bursts between cover. Garrick himself walked straight toward the house, rifle ready but not raised, his scarred face calm as death. He was counting on their reluctance to waste ammunition on a single target, banking on the psychology of siege warfare. The defenders' growing desperation, their fraying nerves, their diminishing resources. He was wrong. Caleb tracked him through the rifle sights, leading him slightly, accounting for distance and the gentle breeze that had picked up with nightfall. When Garrick reached the halfway point between his horse and the porch, Caleb squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Garrick in the left shoulder, spinning him partway around. But the man didn't fall. He staggered, shifted his rifle to his right hand, and kept coming, his face twisted with rage and pain. "Tough bastard," Samuel muttered, firing at the man approaching from the north. His shot went wide, kicking up dust 6 inches from the target's head. Monroe engaged the southern attacker, their exchange of fire brief and vicious. Glass shattered as a bullet punched through the window near Monroe's head, showering him with fragments. He ducked, cursed, and returned fire blind, working on instinct and experience. Garrick reached the porch steps, and Caleb lost his angle. The man was directly below now, using the porch overhang for protection. Caleb could hear his boots on the wooden planks, deliberate footsteps moving toward the door. "He's coming in," Caleb said, abandoning the window and positioning himself with a clear line of sight to the entrance. The door exploded inward, the lock giving way under Garrick's boot. The big man filled the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light, his rifle swinging toward Caleb. They fired simultaneously. Caleb's bullet took Garrick in the chest, dead center. Garrick's shot went high and right, punching through the wall a foot from Caleb's head. The impact drove Garrick backward one step, then two. He looked down at the spreading darkness on his shirt, then back up at Caleb, his expression almost surprised. "Should have taken the deal," he said again, his voice wet and fading. Then he fell backward off the porch, landing hard in the dirt, and didn't move again. The gunfire outside intensified. The northern attacker, seeing Garrick fall, broke cover and rushed the house, firing wildly. Samuel met him with 3 precise shots, the third one ending the charge permanently. The man went down face first, his rifle skittering away across the hard pan. That left one. The southern attacker, smarter or more cautious than his companions, had gone to ground behind the water trough near the barn. From there, he had good cover and clear lines of fire to both the house and Jessup's position in the loft. He was pinned, but dangerous, and as long as he held that position, they couldn't move. "Jessup," Caleb called out. "You have a shot?" "Negative. He's tucked in tight. I need him to move or I need a better angle." Caleb's mind raced through options. They could wait him out, but darkness was falling fast, and fighting at night favored the single shooter who only had to watch 2 positions. They could try to flank him, but that meant exposing someone to his fire. Or they could force his hand, make him choose between staying put and losing. "Monroe, how much ammunition you got left?" 12 rounds. "Samuel?" 16. Caleb looked at Mara, making sure she was still pressed against the wall, still safe. Her eyes were on him, trusting, waiting. "All right," he said quietly. "Here's what we do. Samuel, you and Monroe keep him honest. 1 shot every 30 seconds, just enough to make him stay down. Jessup, when I give the signal, you put 3 rounds into that trough, high as you can without hitting Caleb. I'm going to circle around through the barn, come at him from the east." "That's a long run through open ground," Samuel said. "Not if he's watching you instead of me." "And if he sees you?" "Then you make sure he doesn't see me long enough to matter." Caleb checked his rifle one more time, made sure his pistol was loose in its holster. "Give me 2 minutes to get in position, then start your count." He moved to the back door, the one Monroe had defended earlier, and paused. Looking back, he saw Mara watching him, her knuckles white around the broken boot. "I'll be right back," he told her. "You promise?" He wanted to. Wanted to promise her the sun would rise tomorrow, that everything would be fine, that the bad men would go away and never come back. But Thomas had taught him better than that. Promises were sacred things, not to be offered lightly. "I promise I'll try my damnedest," he said instead. She nodded slowly, accepting the honesty. Papa would have said the same thing. Caleb slipped out into the gathering darkness. The air had cooled rapidly with sunset, carrying the smell of gun smoke and blood and disturbed earth. He moved quickly, but quietly, using the terrain and the failing light for cover, angling toward the barn from the blind side. Behind him, he heard Samuel's rifle crack, the first of the covering shots. The bullet spanged off the water trough with a metallic ring. 30 seconds later, Monroe fired. The rhythm was steady, predictable, keeping the shooter's attention focused on the house. Caleb reached the barn and pressed himself against the eastern wall, breathing hard but controlled. From here, he could hear the shooter shifting position behind the trough, muttering to himself, the words indistinct but the tone clear enough, fear and anger mixing into something volatile. Jessup's face appeared briefly in the loft opening above, barely visible in the gloom. He made eye contact with Caleb and nodded once. "Ready." Caleb raised his hand, counting down silently. 3, 2, 1. He came around the corner fast and low, his rifle up and tracking. Jessup's 3 shots hammered into the trough from above, the impacts forcing the shooter to hunch lower, presenting his back to Caleb's position. "Drop it," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the echoes of gunfire. The shooter spun, bringing his rifle around. He was young, Caleb saw. Maybe 25, with a thin mustache and eyes gone wide with panic. In that split second, Caleb saw the choice forming on the young man's face: surrender or fight. The man chose fight. Caleb's bullet caught him in the center of the chest, the impact lifting him slightly before he fell backward over the trough, landing in a heap on the far side. His rifle clattered against the wood, then went silent. Silence rolled across the ranch like a wave, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a nightbird. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, his rifle still raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he lowered the weapon and walked to the trough, needing to be sure. The young man stared up at the first stars with empty eyes. Caleb knelt beside him and gently closed them. Just a kid, really. Probably thought he was getting easy money, following a hard man on a simple job. Probably never expected to die in the dirt of a Wyoming ranch, far from home, for a cause he didn't understand. "I'm sorry," Caleb said quietly, though he didn't know if he was apologizing to the dead man or to himself. Jessup climbed down from the loft, moving stiffly, and joined Caleb by the body. They stood together in silence for a long moment. "That's all of them," Jessup said finally. "Yeah. You all right?" Caleb looked at his hands, steady despite everything. "Ask me tomorrow." They walked back to the house together, where Samuel and Monroe waited on the porch. The four men stood in a loose circle, nobody speaking, the weight of what they'd done settling over them like a physical thing. Then Mara appeared in the doorway, still clutching the boot, her face streaked with tears she'd finally allowed herself to cry. She looked at each of them in turn, these four hard men who'd killed for her, bled for her, risked everything for a promise made to a dead man. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice small. "It's over," Caleb said, and picked her up, holding her close as she buried her face against his shoulder, and sobbed. He carried her inside, away from the bodies and the blood and the spent brass glinting in the starlight. The others followed, closing the door behind them, shutting out the night and the dead and the terrible cost of keeping a promise. Inside, Monroe lit a lamp while Samuel found the whiskey Caleb kept for medicinal purposes. They sat around the table, passing the bottle, not speaking. Mara had fallen asleep in Caleb's arms, exhausted beyond measure, her small body finally releasing the tension that had kept her upright through the nightmare. "We need to deal with the bodies," Samuel said eventually. "In the morning," Caleb replied. "Tonight, we rest." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we ride into Millridge, talk to the sheriff, tell him what happened." Monroe frowned. "You think he'll see it our way?" "He'll see 8 dead men and 1 living girl. He'll see a ranch that was attacked and defended. The law is clear enough on that." Caleb shifted Mara's weight slightly, careful not to wake her. "And if he doesn't, we'll deal with it. But I'm not hiding what we did. We protected a child. That's nothing to be ashamed of." "Thomas would have been proud," Jessup said quietly. "Of all of us." "Thomas would have found a way to do it without killing anyone," Samuel said with a bitter smile. "But yeah, he'd have understood." They finished the whiskey in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. Outside, the Wyoming night deepened, stars blazing in the clear sky, indifferent to the violence that had scarred the earth below. Caleb carried Mara to her room and laid her gently on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She stirred slightly, her hand tightening on the boot even in sleep. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise." This time, it was a promise he could keep. He returned to the main room where the others had begun the grim work of inventory, checking wounds, counting remaining ammunition, assessing damage. Samuel had a graze across his ribs that would need bandaging. Monroe had cuts from the shattered glass, shallow but numerous. Jessup had wrenched his shoulder climbing down from the loft. Caleb himself had a bullet burn along his left forearm he hadn't even noticed during the fight. They patched each other up with the supplies they had, working with the efficient familiarity of men who'd done this before. Too many times. War had taught them how to triage, how to assess what needed immediate attention and what could wait. When they finished, Samuel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. 8 men. We killed 8 men today. 9. Counting the one Mara's father probably killed before he died, Monroe added. "The Tolliver Syndicate isn't going to take this lying down," Jessup said. "They'll send someone to investigate. When those men don't report back, let them send someone," Caleb interrupted. "Let them send 10 more. 20. The answer's the same. Mara's under protection, and anyone who comes for her gets the same treatment Garrett got." "We can't fight a syndicate," Samuel said reasonably. "We're 4 old men with a few dozen bullets left between us." Then we get more bullets, more men, whatever it takes. Caleb's voice was flat, final. I'm not negotiating on this. She lives. That's the only outcome I'm accepting. Samuel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but we do this smart. We get the law on our side first. Make sure everyone knows what happened here, why it happened. Make it public. Syndicates work in shadows. We drag this into the light, they might back off. And if they don't? Monroe asked. Then we fight, Caleb said simply, again and again for as long as it takes. They slept in shifts that night, 2 men awake at all times, watching the darkness for threats that didn't come. The dead lay where they'd fallen, growing cold under the stars, silent witnesses to the price of debt and honor and choosing wrong. When dawn broke, pale and clean, Caleb walked outside and surveyed the damage. 8 bodies, bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows, blood soaking into the dirt. The ranch looked like a battlefield, which he supposed it had been. But standing in the doorway, safe and alive, was Mara. She held a cup of water he'd pumped for her, drinking slowly, watching him with those old, steady eyes. Morning, he said. Morning. She came down the steps and stood beside him, looking at the bodies without flinching. Are you going to bury them? Have to. Can't leave them for the coyotes. Can I help? No, he said gently. That's not work for you. I want to help. I want to do something. Caleb understood. She needed to feel useful, needed to contribute to her own survival. Sitting idle while others worked on her behalf would eat at her the same way it would eat at him. All right, he said. You can help Monroe patch the walls, and later you can help me write a letter to the territorial governor. We're going to tell him everything that happened here, everything the Tolliver Syndicate did to your father, to you. We're going to make sure people know. She nodded, satisfied with this task. Papa always said sunshine was the best disinfectant. Your father was a wise man. They spent the morning digging graves. The ground was hard, resistant, but the 4 men took turns with the shovel, working methodically. They buried the 8 men in a line on the eastern edge of the property, far enough from the house that Mara wouldn't have to see the graves every day. Jessup, the most religious among them despite his silence on matters of faith, said a few words over the graves. Nothing elaborate, just a simple acknowledgement that these men had been people once, with families and futures, before they chose to follow Garrick into darkness. May they find more peace in death than they gave in life, Jessup said quietly, and that was all. By noon, they'd finished the burials and started repairing the damage to the ranch. Monroe and Mara worked together patching the bullet holes, stuffing them with oakum and covering them with thin boards. Samuel rode into Millridge to fetch the sheriff and start the official process of documenting what had happened. Jessup and Caleb worked on the barn, reinforcing the door and replacing the boards that had been shot through. The sheriff arrived in late afternoon, a grizzled man named Hutchins, who'd seen enough frontier violence to not be shocked by much. He walked the property, examined the graves, listened to Caleb's account with occasional nods. Garrick, he said, when Caleb described the scarred man, heard he was working this territory. Mean son of a bitch, but professional. Usually didn't leave witnesses. He didn't plan to, Caleb said. Hutchins looked at Mara, who sat on the porch watching them. The girl, she's Thomas Hale's daughter? Yeah. Heard Hale died up in Montana. Debt collection gone wrong. That's the story Garrick was selling. Truth is, Hale saw something he shouldn't have, something the Tolliver Syndicate wanted buried. When he wouldn't play along, they killed him and came after his daughter to tie up the loose end. Hutchins was quiet for a moment, chewing on this information. You got proof of that? I've got a letter from Thomas Hale, written before he died, explaining the situation. I've got 8 dead men who attacked my ranch trying to kidnap a child. I've got 4 witnesses who'll testify to everything that happened. Caleb met the sheriff's eyes. What more proof do you need? The Tolliver Syndicate's got reach, Hutchins said carefully. Lawyers, politicians, judges in their pocket. You're stirring up a hornet's nest. Good. Let them get stirred up. Let them come after me instead of an 8-year-old girl. Hutchins studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll file the report, rule it justified defense of property and person. But Whitmore, watch your back. Men like that don't forget. and they don't forgive. Neither do I, Caleb said quietly. After the sheriff left, the four men gathered on the porch one more time. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in familiar shades of fire and blood, as if the world was repeating itself in an endless cycle of violence and beauty. I should head back to the fort tomorrow, Jessup said. They'll be missing me. I need to return to Colorado, Monroe added. Got a ranch of my own that's probably falling apart without me. Samuel nodded. And I've got obligations at Laramie. Can't stay forever, much as I'd like to. Caleb had known this moment was coming. They'd answered his call, honored the debt, stood beside him when it mattered most. But they had their own lives, their own responsibilities. He couldn't ask them to stay. I understand, he said, and I'm grateful. All of you. Thomas was right to trust you. What will you do? Monroe asked. Caleb looked through the window at Mara, who was setting the table for supper, moving through the domestic ritual with careful precision. I'll do what Thomas asked. Keep her safe. Raise her right. Give her the life he wanted her to have. You're taking her in? Samuel asked. Permanent? Unless she doesn't want to stay. And the syndicate? If they come, they come. But I won't be alone. I'll make sure of that. Caleb straightened. I'm going to write to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, every newspaper west of the Mississippi. I'm going to tell Thomas's story, Mara's story, what happened here. I'm going to make it so expensive for the Tolliver syndicate to come after her that they'll decide she's not worth the trouble. Publicity is armor, Monroe said thoughtfully. Smart. Hard to disappear someone when everyone's watching. That's the idea. They ate supper together that night, one last meal before the men dispersed back to their separate lives. Mara had made a stew from the supplies they had left, simple but filling, and they ate slowly, savoring the moment of peace after the storm. You're all leaving, Mara asked quietly. We have to, Samuel said gently, but that doesn't mean we're abandoning you. If Caleb needs us, we'll come. That's a promise. Like you promised Papa? Exactly like that. She nodded, accepting this. Thank you for everything, for keeping me safe, for, her voice wavered, for caring that I lived. Jessup reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. You're worth caring about, Mara Hale. Don't ever forget that. The next morning, they said their goodbyes. Each man shook Caleb's hand, embraced him briefly, promised to stay in touch. They ruffled Mara's hair, told her to stay strong, reminded her that she had family now, even if it was scattered across 3 territories. Then they mounted up and rode away, 3 separate directions, leaving Caleb and Mara alone on the ranch. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time since Mara had arrived, it was just the 2 of them, without the presence of other men, without the threat of violence hanging over them. Caleb looked down at the girl beside him. She looked back up, her hand still clutching the broken boot, her expression uncertain. So, he said, I suppose we should talk about what happens now. What do you mean? I mean you've got choices. You can stay here with me if you want. I'll teach you what I know, keep you safe, raise you the best I can. Or I can help you find other family if you've got any. Aunt, uncle, cousins, whatever you want. Mara was quiet for a long moment, thinking this through with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, Papa told me once that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when everyone else walks away. Caleb's throat tightened. You showed up, she continued softly. Even though you didn't have to. Even though it almost got you killed. You kept your promise to Papa. You kept me safe. She looked up at him with those old, steady eyes. I want to stay, if you'll have me. I'd be honored, Caleb said, his voice rough. She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 15 years finally loosened. All right then, he said. I guess that makes you my daughter now. And you're my... She hesitated, testing the word. Father? If you want me to be. She considered this, then nodded firmly. I do. They stood together on the porch, watching the empty road, the endless sky, the land that had tested them and nearly broken them, but had ultimately become home. The broken boot rested between them, a reminder of promises kept and debts finally paid. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, The future felt like something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. Caleb had lived alone for so long that having another person in the house felt strange at first, like wearing boots that didn't quite fit. But Mara moved through the space with quiet consideration, learning his patterns, adjusting her own to match. She woke when he woke, helped with chores without being asked, and filled the silence with presence rather than noise. He taught her what he knew: how to read the weather by the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals, how to mend fence and stack hay, and judge a horse's temperament by the set of its ears. She absorbed everything with that fierce concentration she'd inherited from Thomas, asking questions that were sharp and thoughtful, never satisfied with surface answers. In the evenings, after supper, she would pull out the broken boot and sit with it in her lap while Caleb read aloud from the few books he owned. She never put it away, never let it out of reach, and he understood why. It was the last physical piece of her father she possessed, the tangible proof that he'd existed, that he'd loved her enough to send her to safety even as his own world collapsed. One night, about 3 weeks after the others had left, Mara looked up from the boot and asked, "Will you tell me about Papa? About what he was like during the war?" Caleb set down the book he'd been reading, a collection of Robert Burns' poetry that had belonged to his mother. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Anything." She traced the worn leather with one finger. "He never talked about it much, said it was over and didn't need remembering, but I want to know who he was before I was born." Caleb leaned back in his chair, searching his memory for the right place to begin. "Your father was the kind of man who saw good in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves." "I told you that before, but it's worth saying again because it's the truest thing about him." "What else?" "He was stubborn as hell," Caleb said with a faint smile. "Once he decided something was right, you couldn't budge him with a team of horses. And he was brave, but not in the loud way some men are. Quiet brave. The kind that shows up when everyone else has run." Mara listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. "There was this one time, middle of winter, we were camped outside Chattanooga. Half the company was sick with fever, myself included. We were out of medicine, out of supplies, and the supply wagons wouldn't come for another week. Your father walked 15 miles through snow to the nearest town, bought medicine with his own pay, and walked back. Carried it all himself because he didn't trust anyone else to get it there. Did you get better?" "I did. So did most of the others. 3 men would have died without that medicine." Caleb's voice softened. He never mentioned it afterward. Didn't want credit, didn't want thanks. Just did what needed doing and moved on. "That sounds like Papa," Mara said quietly. "Yeah, it does." She was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you think he knew? That they'd kill him?" Caleb chose his words carefully. "I think he knew he was in danger, and I think he chose to protect you instead of himself. That's what fathers do, Mara, the good ones anyway." "Is that what you're doing? Protecting me instead of yourself?" "I'm doing what I promised Thomas I'd do," Caleb said, "and what I want to do. There's no instead about it. Keeping you safe doesn't cost me anything I'm not willing to give." She nodded slowly, accepting this, and returned her attention to the boot. After a moment, she said, "I think I'm ready to put it away now." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "You sure?" "Papa gave it to me so I could find you. I found you. The boot did its job." She stood and walked to her room, returning a moment later empty-handed. "I'll always keep it, but I don't need to carry it everywhere anymore." It was a small thing, but Caleb understood its significance. She was choosing to move forward, to build a life instead of clinging to remnants of the one she'd lost. It was the kind of courage that couldn't be taught, only chosen. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. She smiled at him, and in that smile he saw Thomas as clearly as if his old friend stood in the room with them. The letter Caleb had written to the territorial governor generated more response than he'd anticipated. Within a month, a federal marshal arrived to take statements and examine the graves. He was a thorough man named Patterson, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "The Tolliver Syndicate has been on our radar for a while," Patterson said, sitting at Caleb's table with a cup of coffee and a notebook. "But they're slippery, Good lawyers, careful operations, hard to pin anything on them that'll stick in court. 8 dead men on my property ought to stick, Caleb said. In terms of what happened here, absolutely. Self-defense, clear as day. Patterson tapped his pencil against the notebook. But connecting this to the larger pattern of intimidation, fraud, and murder they're running across 3 territories, that's harder. We need evidence, witnesses, documentation. Thomas Hale was documenting it, Mara said suddenly. She'd been sitting quietly in the corner, but now she stood and walked to the table. I remember. He had a notebook. He wrote in it every night, recording things he saw during his surveying work, dates, locations, names. Patterson leaned forward. Where's this notebook now? I don't know. He kept it in his saddlebag, always. When he told me to run, he didn't give it to me. She frowned, thinking. But he might have hidden it. He was careful about things like that. Where did you live? Patterson asked gently. Before you came here? Near Helena. Little cabin outside town near the creek. Patterson made a note. The cabin still there? I don't know. I haven't been back. Caleb saw where this was leading and didn't like it. You want to search the cabin? If there's evidence there, yes. Documentation of what Hale witnessed, what he knew. It could be the break we need to bring charges against the syndicate's leadership, not just their hired guns. And you want Mara to go with you, Caleb said flatly, to show you where things are. It would help, but only if she's willing. Patterson looked at Mara with surprising kindness. You've been through enough, Miss Hale. I won't force you, but if you're willing to help, you'd be doing your father's memory a great service. Mara looked at Caleb, uncertainty in her eyes. He could see the fear there, the reluctance to revisit the place where her life had shattered. But he could also see something else, something harder and brighter. The desire to finish what Thomas had started. It's your choice, Caleb said quietly. But whatever you decide, I'm going with you. She straightened her shoulders, and he saw Thomas in that gesture too, that stubborn refusal to let fear make decisions. I'll go, she said. Papa would want his work to mean something. They left 2 days later, Caleb and Mara riding with Patterson and 2 deputy marshals toward Montana. The journey took 4 days, traveling through country that grew increasingly familiar to Mara as they progressed. Caleb watched her carefully, noting the way her hands tightened on the reins as they crossed certain landmarks, the way her breathing changed when they passed through Helena. The cabin sat empty and abandoned, its door hanging open, windows broken. Someone had been through it already, probably Garrick's men searching for the same thing Patterson wanted. The interior had been ransacked, furniture overturned, floorboards pried up, the mattress torn apart. Mara stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed. They destroyed everything. Not necessarily, Patterson said, scanning the wreckage with professional eyes. People who tear a place apart looking for something usually miss the obvious hiding spots. They're looking for clever concealment. Sometimes the best hiding place is the simple one. Papa wasn't clever about hiding things, Mara said slowly. He was practical. He'd put something important somewhere he could get to it quickly if he needed it, but somewhere most people wouldn't think to look. She walked through the cabin, stepping over debris, her eyes moving methodically. Caleb and Patterson followed, letting her work through the problem in her own way. She stopped at the fireplace, staring at the cold ashes. Then she knelt and reached up into the chimney, her arm disappearing into the sooty darkness. When she pulled it back, her hand was black with ash and clutching a leather-wrapped bundle. He taught me about this, she said quietly. Said in winter, the chimney's the warmest place in the house. In summer, it's the coolest, and most people don't think to look up. Patterson carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a notebook, its pages dense with Thomas Hale's neat handwriting. Dates, locations, names, descriptions of illegal land transfers, fraudulent water rights claims, surveying data that had been falsified to benefit syndicate operations. It was meticulous, damning, and exactly what Patterson needed. This is gold, Patterson said reverently. Your father was building a case, Miss Hale, a comprehensive one. With this, we can connect the Tolliver Syndicate to crimes spanning 5 years and 3 territories. Will it be enough? Caleb asked. More than enough. This is evidence that'll hold up in any court. Patterson looked at Mara with open respect. Your father was a brave man, and you just finished what he started. On the ride back to Wyoming, Mara was quieter than usual, processing what they'd found and what it meant. That night, camped under stars that seemed close enough to touch, she sat beside Caleb by the fire. "Do you think Papa knew they'd kill him?" she asked, "when he hid the notebook?" "I think he knew it was possible," Caleb said, "and he made sure that even if they did, the truth would survive him. He could have run, could have taken me and disappeared. He could have, but then the syndicate would have kept doing what they were doing, cheating people, stealing land, destroying lives. Your father wasn't the kind of man who could walk away from that. Even if it meant leaving me alone?" Caleb turned to look at her directly. "He didn't leave you alone, Mara. He sent you to me. He made sure you'd be safe, that you'd be taken care of, that someone would finish what he started. That's not abandonment, that's love." She was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Then she leaned against his shoulder, and Caleb put his arm around her, holding her while the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. The trial took place in Denver 4 months later. Caleb and Mara traveled to attend, along with Samuel, Monroe, and Jessup, who'd come from their various corners of the frontier to bear witness. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, victims of the syndicate's operations, and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle. Thomas Hale's notebook was entered into evidence, each page photographed and cataloged. Caleb testified about the attack on his ranch, his voice steady and factual. Mara, granted special permission due to her age, gave her account of her father's death and her subsequent flight to Wyoming. Her testimony was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "They killed my father because he told the truth," she said from the witness stand, her voice clear despite her small size. "And they tried to kill me because I existed, because I was proof that what they did mattered." The defense attorneys tried to discredit the notebook, to suggest that Thomas Hale had fabricated evidence out of malice or mental instability. But the sheer volume of corroborating detail, dates that matched land transfers, locations that aligned with fraudulent claims, names that connected to known syndicate operatives, overwhelmed their objections. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, intimidation, and accessory to murder. The Tolliver Syndicate's leadership was sentenced to prison terms ranging from 15 to 30 years. Their assets were seized, their operations dismantled, their reach broken. Outside the courthouse, Patterson found Caleb and Mara on the steps. "Justice moves slow sometimes," he said, "but it moves. Your father's work accomplished something real, Miss Hale. Hundreds of people are going to get their land back, their water rights restored, their lives repaired. That's his legacy." "Will they come after us again?" Mara asked. "The people who worked for the syndicate?" "Not if they're smart. The spotlight's on this case now. Anyone who tries anything will have federal attention on them immediately." Patterson tipped his hat. "You're safe, both of you, and you've earned it." They returned to Wyoming as the first snow of winter began to fall, transforming the landscape into something clean and new. The ranch had never looked better to Caleb, the familiar lines of fence and barn and house welcoming them home like an embrace. Life settled into its new normal. Mara attended the school in Millridge 3 days a week, riding the 8 miles on the bay mare Caleb had given her for her 9th birthday. She made friends cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, her natural intelligence and quiet strength earning respect from teachers and students alike. She grew taller, stronger, more settled in herself. The nightmares that had plagued her first months gradually faded. The old look in her eyes softened, making room for moments of genuine childhood joy. She laughed more, smiled easier, argued with Caleb about chores and homework with the comfortable irritation of a daughter who knew she was loved. Caleb discovered that fatherhood suited him better than he'd expected. Teaching Mara to ride, helping her with arithmetic, listening to her read aloud from the books they bought in town. These small rituals filled spaces in his life he hadn't known were empty. The ranch felt alive again, purposeful, like it had finally become what it was always meant to be. A home. The years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons turning, of cattle growing fat on summer grass and weathering winter storms, of crops planted and harvested and planted again. Samuel visited twice a year, bringing news from Fort Laramie and the wider world. Monroe came less frequently but stayed longer, helping with major repairs and swapping stories around the fire. Jessup wrote letters, his careful handwriting filling pages with observations about weather, politics, and the slow march of civilization across the frontier. When Mara turned 16, tall and capable and sharp as her father had ever been, she announced her intention to become a surveyor like Thomas. Caleb wasn't surprised. She'd always had his gift for mathematics and his love of maps, his need to understand how pieces fit together to form a whole. "You'll be good at it," he said simply. "Will you worry?" "Every day. But I worried every day when you were 8, and I'll worry every day when you're 80. That's what fathers do." She hugged him then, fierce and quick, already pulling away toward her future, but still tethered to the home they'd built together. The broken boot sat on a shelf in her room, carefully preserved, a reminder of the journey that had brought them together. Beside it, she kept her father's surveying equipment, inherited through Patterson's efforts, and the compass Caleb had given her when she started school. On the anniversary of Thomas Hale's death each year, they rode out to a small hill overlooking the ranch and sat together in silence. Mara never cried anymore, but Caleb could see the weight of memory in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes went distant. He didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes. He just sat beside her, a steady presence, until she was ready to return. When Mara turned 18, she left for Denver to study surveying formally, her bags packed with clothes Caleb had bought, books he'd saved for, and enough money to see her through 2 years of schooling. The day she left, Caleb stood on the porch watching her ride away, and for the first time in years, he felt the old loneliness creeping back. But it was different now, not the hollow emptiness of a man hiding from his past, but the bittersweet ache of a father watching his daughter step into her own life. She'd return. He knew that. The ranch was as much hers as his, and the bond they'd forged through fire and loss wasn't something that distance could break. She came back 3 years later with a surveyor's certificate, a job offer from the territorial government, and a young man named David Chen who looked at her the way Caleb imagined Thomas had looked at Mara's mother. Chen was quiet and steady, with kind eyes and calloused hands, and when he asked Caleb for permission to marry Mara, Caleb saw in him the same quality that had defined Thomas Hale, the courage to choose right over easy. "She makes her own choices," Caleb said, "but you've got my blessing if she wants it." The wedding took place at the ranch on a clear summer day with Samuel, Monroe, and Jessup in attendance, all of them older and grayer but still standing straight. They drank to Thomas Hale's memory, to promises kept, to debts paid in full. And when Caleb walked Mara down the aisle he'd built in the yard, he felt Thomas's presence so strongly it was almost physical. "He'd be proud of you," Caleb whispered to her before placing her hand in David's. "He'd be proud of you too," she whispered back. Mara and David settled in Cheyenne, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to build their own life. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, whom they brought to the ranch every summer. The children ran through the same fields where their mother had learned to ride, fed the same chickens, pumped water from the same well. On quiet evenings, Mara would tell them stories about their grandfather Thomas, about his courage and kindness and stubborn commitment to doing right. She'd show them the broken boot, carefully preserved now in a glass case, and explain how it had carried a promise across 4 days and hundreds of miles. "Your grandfather gave his life so I could have mine," she'd tell them. "And Caleb gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. That's what family does. Not because they have to, but because they choose to." The children would listen with wide eyes, already learning the lessons their mother had learned, already understanding that some debts were too important to measure in money or time. Caleb grew old on the ranch, his hair going white, his movement slower but still steady. He sold off most of the cattle, keeping just enough to maintain the land, and spent his days reading, repairing, watching the seasons turn. Samuel passed first, then Monroe, then Jessup, each death taking a piece of the past with it, but leaving behind memories worth preserving. On his 75th birthday, sitting on the porch with Mara beside him and her children playing in the yard, Caleb said quietly, "I kept my promise to your father." "You did more than that," Mara said. "You gave me a life. A real one, full of love and purpose and belonging. That's more than keeping a promise. That's building a legacy." "Thomas built the legacy. I just honored it." "Then we'll honor it together," she said, taking his hand, "for as long as we're able." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children chase each other through the long grass, their laughter carrying on the wind. The land stretched away in all directions, beautiful and enduring, marked by the lives of those who'd fought for it, and the love of those who'd made it home. The broken boot remained on its shelf, no longer a symbol of loss, but a testament to survival. Beside it, Mara had placed a photograph of Caleb and Thomas in their Union uniforms, young and serious, not yet knowing the paths their lives would take or the promises they'd be called to keep. When Caleb passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Mara buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, beside a marker she'd placed years earlier for her father. The inscription she chose for Caleb's stone was simple. Caleb Whitmore, he kept his promise. At the funeral, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Mara told the story one more time. About a young girl with bare feet and a broken boot, about 4 old soldiers who chose courage over safety, about promises kept across years and distance and the terrible cost of doing right. "My father sent me to find a good man," she said, her voice strong despite the tears on her face. "And I found him. Caleb taught me that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when everyone else walks away. Sometimes it's the stranger who opens his door and says, 'You're safe now.' Sometimes it's the promise kept, even when keeping it means risking everything." She placed the broken boot on Caleb's grave, finally releasing it after all these years. It had served its purpose, carried its message, led her to safety. Now it could rest beside the man who'd made good on the faith her father had placed in him. Years later, when Mara's grandchildren asked about the stories their mother told, about the ranch and the siege and the 4 old soldiers, Mara would take them to the hill and show them the graves. "This is where it all comes from," she'd say. "The land, the legacy, the understanding that some things matter more than our own comfort or safety. Your great-grandfather Thomas Hale died protecting the truth. Caleb Whitmore lived honoring that sacrifice. And we carry both their names forward, not because we have to, but because we choose to." The ranch endured through generations, passed from Mara to her son to his children, each steward adding their own story while preserving the foundation laid by Thomas's courage and Caleb's faithfulness. The broken boot was eventually donated to the Territorial Museum, where it sat in a glass case with a placard explaining its journey and significance. But the real legacy lived on in the children who learned about promises kept, in the families who understood that doing right sometimes costs everything, in the quiet courage of people who choose to show up when others walk away. And on clear Wyoming nights, when the stars blazed overhead and the wind whispered through the grass, those who knew the story could almost hear the echoes of it all. A father's desperate gamble, a girl's long walk to safety, 4 old soldiers standing against the darkness, and one man's simple choice to honor a debt that couldn't be measured in gold or time. Some promises, once made, echo through generations. Some debts, once paid, transform into gifts that keep giving. And some stories, once lived, become the foundation on which families and futures are built. This was one of those stories. And it ended not with an ending, but with a beginning. The beginning of understanding that love, loyalty, and courage aren't just words, but choices made fresh every day, in every generation, by people who decide that some things are worth fighting for. The broken boot had carried Mara home, but it was the promise. Thomas's to Caleb, Caleb's to Mara, Mara's to her children, that carried the legacy forward into a future bright with possibility and grounded in the knowledge that when the world asks too much, there will always be people who choose to give enough.